calls Stuart Stevenson up to 10 minutes, Minister.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And let me start by thanking Jackie Bailey for introducing this bill, and indeed her alter ego, or as perhaps Dr McKee might term it, her doppelganger, Karen Gillan, for so ably filling the breach, and indeed to Mary Mulligan, who supported what was going on as well. As Jackie is aware, and members throughout the Parliament are aware, the Scottish Government is committed to the principles behind this bill. And I take the opportunity of thanking all members who have contributed to today's debate, which has been interesting and indicative of the Parliament's engagement on the issue of support for people with disabilities. I think everyone who spoke today, and I would single Patricia Ferguson and others did, who made a particularly thoughtful and useful and informative contribution. Every person who spoke has made a useful contribution. And thanks are also due to the Society of Chief Officers of Transportation in Scotland, COSLA, and the Non-Executive Bills Unit for their work in trying to obtain robust implementation costs. Yes, we haven't yet completed that particular task, but I think there is honest endeavour has been undertaken, and we will continue to work at official and ministerial level in partnership with COSLA and the local authorities to ensure best value is achieved in the one-off national implementation exercise. The figure of £3 million appears to be the one around which we are coalescing as the likely real cost, and that is one that does not unduly alarm me as Minister. One of the tangible results at the end of the process will be annual reports from local authorities and an annual report from government. I believe these reports will offer openness and transparency when it comes to the processes surrounding the provision and enforcement of disabled parking bays, and will let the public know if local authorities are carrying out their duties in relation to this bill. Before turning to the contributions of members and picking up some of the points that have been made, I also would like to thank the Mobility and Access Committee for Scotland for their advice on the bill. I am sure they are one of many organisations that will be scrutinising the annual reports. Patricia Ferguson said the debate is not about disability, and she is absolutely spot on. The reality is the debate is about the able-bodied. It is about the behaviour of the able-bodied. It is about changing the attitudes of the able-bodied, because it is only when that happens that we actually deliver for the disabled. So perhaps that is where our primary focus should be. The issue of a campaign of information is one that Patricia Ferguson raised at stage 2. I confirm that we will mount such a campaign. We will liaise with the local authorities and other stakeholders in early course to make sure that the good information that is necessary to make this bill a success is put in front of people. Patricia Ferguson said that we have been rather legislation light in the last 2 years. Well, we are always happy to work with others in the Parliament to build the consensus for legislation, and on this particular example, coming as it does from the Labour benches, is a good model for the work that can be done before we get to the floor of the Chamber to build a consensus. And that consensus is clearly, based on today's debate, going to endure up to and through 5 o'clock tonight. Bob Doris described his father's experiences, as many others drew on familiar experience. I would say to Bob, of course, a charge or a fine, whatever you call it, is a mark of failure of the system. A mark of success will be the change of behaviours that we all look for. Charlie Gordon talked about disabled drivers. I think we should, Presiding Officer, also, of course, consider it's not just the drivers who may be disabled, it may be the passengers, and the blue badge holders are often, in essence, people who are unable or have simply not learned to drive. So it's a wider community than simply the drivers. Ian McKee talked about his mother who drove without a test. Well, I'm familiar with this. My father too drove on the roads without a test. I rather wished on many occasions that he had had to go through the rigour of a test, and indeed in his later years he worked as a driver for the WRVS, and they too occasionally wished that he'd gone through the rigour of a driving test. My mother, Helen Mary Berry McGregor, was someone who walked on sticks for almost all of her adult life. She could only walk from her knees. When she was in a car, she was a different animal altogether. She had the 47th of the Mini Cooper S's that were built in 1962, and this was before Barbara Castle introduced the national speed limit. And I do recall being with my mother driving in a Mini Cooper S along the Bagley Strait toward Bridge of Erne, doing over 100 miles an hour. Once she got, however, to the supermarket car park, she was down to about half a mile an hour. So therefore, the mobility that comes from a car and the ability that it delivers to people who are disabled is a very significant part of their lives. Duncan McNeill said stores don't need to wait to follow the example of Asda. I think it was Abraham Lincoln who said, I'm not entirely certain, but certainly it's a saying I have in my mind, the early bird gets the worm, the later eats the dirt. And I think those who are playing catch-up play a dangerous game. Those who exercise leadership can often see commercial success, as well as, of course, supporting corporate social responsibility aims. Duncan McNeill also returned to the subject of criminality in relation to the abuse of parking spaces. One of the chief constables in Scotland said to me that his experience was that people who abuse parking places are 4 times as likely to already have a criminal conviction. So the link between a general pattern of disobeying the rules and the laws of our society can often be illuminated by the fact that they're prepared to break the rules in a disabled parking space. And I think police forces that I've talked to have told me of success they've had in general criminal justice successes in focusing on people who are abusing parking places. So, to those who think of abusing a disabled parking space, think on this. You will be thought to be a criminal right at the outset. Michael McMahon, I think, drew me to the thought of a car as a status symbol, and indeed Jackson Carlaw said that Mercedes and Audis were now being converted under the Motability scheme. One of my aunts, also called Stuart, my Aunt Stuart, had one of these three-wheelers. On one occasion, she drove it into a ditch, and helpful motorists, because of the light weight of a three-wheeler, were able to lift it out and put it back on the road for her. So actually the three-wheeler had some significant advantages, which would not be the case if she'd been driving, I don't know, a Mercedes ML 55 instead. It would have been more difficult to lift back into the road. Although my Aunt Stuart, I think, would not have been able to afford a Mercedes. So there have been, over the years, many ways in which successive administrations have sought to support those with mobility difficulties. And I think this bill takes us further forward. Sandra White suggested we should look at extending the options for blue badge holders. We're certainly working with the UK government on that issue, and we will continue to engage actively on it. We are responsible, of course, in Scotland for some of the regulations, but the basic structure of the blue badge system, which of course was introduced to follow the orange badge system, which is the one that my mother had on her Mini Cooper S over 40 years ago. This bill is one which will give dignity to people who have mobility restrictions, will give opportunity to the disabled in our society. It's an earnest mark of this Parliament's commitment to those who suffer a degree of disadvantage in our society. I will take very great pleasure in pressing the yes button when invited to vote for this bill at 5 o'clock, Presiding Officer.